Welcome again to the Washington SXM podcast. As always, you know the drill. Like, share, comment, subscribe. The like is free, so click the like button. It helps with the algorithm for this video to go to the masses. So you know how that works. Click the like button. It's right there on the left. Let's get into this review. I'm gonna do quick. It's from Thomas Sowell. He written a few books. He's an economist. He's a brilliant um, black professor. He's now retired, but he's been hidden away from the world because they don't push his books and his ideas on YouTube because they don't want he to enlighten too much of black people. So let's get into it. This one is about the facts about slavery and why they did not tell us this in school. That's basically what he's saying. So let's get into it and hear what he's saying.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked.
Hear that part?
The peoples
People was
of the
enslaved because of
Balkans were enslaved
vulnerability.
by fellow
When they were vulnerable.
Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians
Yeah, I've
enslaved
known
other
enough that
Asians.
facts, yeah.
Africans enslaved other Africans. And the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself.
Hence how the slave trade
Wherever
started.
a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders.
Don't forget the name
Maasai.
Maasai. You're gonna hear the name again,
In
Maasai.
conjunction with Arabs,
The tribe in
enslaved
Africa.
their more
East
vulnerable
Africa.
neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding
And
other Africans
Abyssinians.
and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa,
Hear that?
ranging over an
Arabs.
area
The
larger than
lead
all of
slave traders
Europe.
in Africa.
The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of
You know,
slavery
about
has
2
reached
million.
most
That's a
people
lot of
today
people.
has been along the lines of the best-selling book and
That's the
widely watched
Thomas Sowell,
television
as you can
miniseries
see.
Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history."
That's the
or
director of
performative
Roots.
history,
Did a big
is open to the
disservice to
same
black people.
objections
Have
as
we
other
believing in
instrumental
this?
myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to
Because
catch slaves
white people is
himself.
fragile, you know,
The
as
average life
thick skin because of our
expectancy of a white
melanin
man in the
is why we're
interior
so
of
resistant
sub-Saharan
to
Africa
sickness.
at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was
Again,
only
because
much
of
later,
they're fragile,
after
they get sick
quinine and
easy.
other medical
They can't
measures
withstand
enabled
the
Europeans to survive,
like
where there were
Africans,
tropical diseases,
the weather.
was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans who established the
Because
conditions
there
under
was a
which
lot of
slave
kings in
sales took
Africa from
place.
different tribes.
The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples.
which
the
is in the
same
most
pattern found
culture.
over the
Stronger
centuries in
people
Europe,
tend to
Asia,
use
the
weaker
Western
people.
Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Ankole enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai
Tutsi and the
dominated over
Hutu.
the
I've heard of those
Kikuyu
tribes
in
before as
Congo.
well. The
And the
Tutsis and
latter,
the
in
Hutus.
turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture
Yeah,
and
a lot
wives
did
being whipped as
commit
they tried to
suicide.
cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis
See that brutality
pointed
of
out
beating
that Europeans had
their
little
wives in
contact
front of their
with the
husbands,
actual process of enslavement,
or vice
and
versa.
that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South.
So as I
who
can
were
see there,
commercial
that's
slave
10
owners,
black slave owners that will
just
tear
like
apart
their white
historical
counterparts.
perceptions, which is what
An
they
estimated
hid
one-third
from
of the free
some,
persons
most of his
color in New
history
Orleans
books and
were
history.
slave owners,
Or even in
and
school,
thousands of
they
these
hid the
slave
fact that
owners
we have
volunteered to fight for
slave
the
owners,
Confederacy
black.
during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean.
Yes,
short,
that I know. I'm from
there were
Jamaica.
many defenders of
There were a
slavery
lot
in
of
the
black
West,
slave owners
even
in
in the
Jamaica and
19th century.
plantations.
And outside the West,
My
slavery
great-grandfather was
too
one.
widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured.
That they don't need a medal for that.
How and
The
why
fact is they
did
started the
slavery end
slavery
in most of the
trade
world?
on a mass scale
There were
in
two
the
major
Western world.
processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of
It's
sub-Saharan
about to
Africa.
finish now, so.
By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe
You can stop it there because it's coming to the end of it. So most of these facts that I'm listening to now, I'm seeing here now, I didn't know before I watched this video because I have seen a few snippets of it. I didn't watch the entire video, so. But I think in the new movie, The Woman King, I haven't seen it, so don't quote me on this. But I think if I remember correctly, the tribe in that movie was the Messiah, and if it is, here, and you can read this in the book. I will put the link in the description for the book that they take this from, which is from Thomas Sowell. And you see, so slavery wasn't solely based off race then. Because remember, you have the Arabs and the Portuguese and the Spaniards, all those people. There were slave owners as well. Europe in general. But America become slave traders, and then they take it to another level when they bring the slaves to the Western world, which like the Americas and the Caribbean. So I don't observe them because they abolish slavery, because they magnify slavery and a vast a vast area, and keep Africans enslaved, I think, the longest out of any other enslavers, if I'm correct, which I think I am. And don't forget we had black slave owners as well, because I know of this before this video, because as I said, my great grandfather was a slave owner, because at the time I did some research on him, and he have two families live next to each other on two separate property, and and he was a sheriff as well. So only those guys holding those kind of power can do something like that. But I forgot his name. Off the top of my head, because I did this a while back, but I already read about it, about my great grandfather that was a slave owner and a sheriff. So back to the topic at hand. So as I can see, we need to open up our mind to more knowledge, to not only blame, which I am not observing white people of slavery. I will never do that, because they play a major role in that. But keep in mind, they was a part of the problem, not the only part of the problem. Because I always tell people, black people enslaved black people, Asian enslaved Asians, and Europeans enslaved Europeans, because of the area. It's not until they had boats and they could go across the ocean, and that's how they got to mix now and pay for slaves from different continents, and then hence the start of slave trade. So please, people, do some more research, and so you can get more knowledge of the past, because if you don't know the past, you don't repeat the future. Repeat it back. And don't forget, they are selling all this misconception now, and they're trying to rewrite history, literally changing books and changing the narrative to fit a certain narrative to push out to this younger generation who have less knowledge of history. Anyway, I won't go much more in this, because I don't want the video to be too long, because I could go all night with this topic. So click the like button, help this video to go to the masses again, because we want this message to go out there. So anyway, peace. You don't know what it is. One love.